All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on new advances in research and tools for heat health planning. I am Allison Whitaker. I'm with the State Climate Office, and I'm the Extension Associate there. I'll be moderating today. So I'm going to get started by telling you a little bit about the State Climate Office. We are located at the NC State campus. We are a public service center for North Carolina, and we have 11 full-time staff. We operate the North Carolina EcoNet, which consists of 45 research-grade weather stations across the state, including the one that you see on that image, located at an agricultural research facility in Salisbury. So now I'm going to hand it over to Michael Gravazzi to tell us a little bit about the USDA Southeast Climate Hub, who has supported the work that we're going to be talking about today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Gravazzi, a natural resource specialist with USDA Forest Service Eastern Threat Center, the coordinator for the Southeast Climate Hub. Climate Hub's mission is to provide tools and other resources that help farmers, foresters, and other working land managers build resilience to disturbance and threats through informed decision-making. The region covers the 11 southeastern states you see here, from Virginia along the coast to Louisiana and up through Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. To reach producers, land managers, and technical service providers in the region, we frequently work with extension agents and other subject matter experts to identify knowledge or resource gaps, and then co-produce resources that fill those needs. A few examples of our collaborative work are shown on the slide. We're also working with extension agents in the Southeast to develop and publish drought preparation and recovery commodity guides. So I'm not listed here. Our first guide for forage producers was just produced. We're really excited about this timely document and guidance. And we have 10 more commodity guides in production that we hope to get out soon. We've been very fortunate to have had a close and very productive working relationship with the North Carolina State Climate Office since the hub was established in 2014. Thanks for letting us be a part of this, and please reach out if you'd like to follow up with us.
Thanks so much, Michael. All right, so now we're going to hand it over to Renee Richardson from the NOAA Program Office to tell us a little bit about their programs.
Thanks, Allison. If you don't mind, I believe the next slide belongs to our program. Awesome, thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Renee Richardson, and I am the program manager for the Observations Program that sits within the NOAA's Weather Program Office. So WPO sits under NOAA's line office, the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, where the mission really resides in driving innovative research across the earth sciences to support operational needs. So for WPO, that focuses on, well, you guessed it, innovative weather research. And WPO itself is made up of 9 programs across 4 divisions, and with one of those programs being our own, the Observations Program. So what do? Our mission is pretty straightforward. We aim to advance observing capabilities to improve operational weather forecasts and decision support. And the umbrella of observing capabilities that we support covers technologies that both strengthen core systems already in place that we know and love, but also those innovative systems that really push the envelope of emerging technologies. So both ends of the spectrum a bit. So also want to point out that observational studies and technologies that we support covers all weather hazards, including extreme temperatures. And I'm really excited to be here today, as is the rest of our team, Sandy LaCourte and Justin Bickett, who are also online, because we began supporting Dr. Tim Glotfelty through our external funding competition back in 2023. On the previous slide, I believe Tim's project was listed. And we just really enjoyed being involved with he and his project team's work, surrounding extreme heat in the Carolinas. And that said, we're really excited for today and ready to learn more about the latest research pertaining to extreme heat in the Southeast region. Thanks for having us. And if anyone online would like to learn more about WPO and our program, please visit the website that's listed right here. at the bottom. Our contact information is on our website as well. So thank you. Looking forward to today, and back to you, Allison.
Thanks so much, Renee. All right, so we have a broad range of attendees today, from folks on working lands to researchers to our friends at NOAA. And we hope after today's presentation, you will have learned something new or looked at something from a different perspective. So let's review the agenda. We are going to be covering heat monitoring basics to get started with. Then we're going to move into that extreme heat research, the kind of new explorations that we've been doing, the new findings that we've uncovered. Then we're going to wrap up today with heat health impacts and an introduction to our brand new tool, the Southeast Heat Monitor. Ultimately, today we want you to be able to leave with actionable ways to assess heat risk on a daily basis. So you may have noticed that there is a Q&A button at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. Please feel free to use that. Ask questions throughout the presentations today. Some of those we're going to be answering in different ways, so we may be answering those either in the Q&A section or we'll hold those for the discussion at the end. All right, so now that all the logistics are taken care of, let's talk about heat. Why is heat so important? Well, 2023, 2024, and 2025 were the hottest years on record globally. During those years, both rural and urban communities across the Southeast experienced record-breaking heat. Last summer in North Carolina alone, more than 5,700 people visited the emergency department for heat-related illness. Heat is the most deadly weather hazard. As you see here from the National Weather Service, heat's right here in the center. It's more dangerous than hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. So the thing with heat, though, is that it can be really difficult to measure. And so that is why I want to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Greg Tierney, to help us understand a little bit more about heat measurements.
Great, thank you, Allison. We're going to talk a little bit about heat monitoring basics now, and Greg Tierney from a research scholar at the State Climate Office. And Allison kind of talked about why heat is important, but we can also talk about when heat is most important and thinking about what a heat season is, similar to a hurricane season, say. And as you can see here, this is including degree days, so thinking about it from more of a utility angle, but we still focus between May and September is kind of the traditional heat season for North America, for the Southeast. So how do we measure heat, though? And this may seem a simple question on its face, but there's a lot of different ways to do this. And I'm going to kind of go through three of them quickly here today, just to get everybody up to speed and on the same page. So first we have air temperature, which is probably the most familiar to all of us in our weather apps on weather.gov. Here's your traditional Stevenson screen, and then the observation inside, as you can see, at many weather stations around the country. But if we want to think about heat and human health together, we also have to think about moisture content in the atmosphere, whether through the dew point or through relative humidity. And the heat index starts to get at that. And we're perhaps most familiar with the heat index through this chart that we've all seen, relative humidity on one axis, temperature on the other axis. But there's actually some assumptions that go into this. So the heat index is actually based on a model human being, and then the equations to make that chart were extrapolated out in the early 90s. And then a model human being actually has a height of 5'7", a weight of just under 148 pounds. They're wearing a short sleeve and pants, walking at just over 3 miles an hour, and perhaps most importantly, it's measured in the shade. So this is one thing I think a lot of people often overlook when thinking about heat index is that they think, oh, I'm outside, the heat index applies. If you're in the shade, it can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer if you're in direct sunlight. And also, how do the people you're thinking about in terms of heat stress compare to that model human being? These are important things to keep in mind when you're thinking about heat metrics for people you are in charge of, or yourself, or your family, or your community. So thinking about heat index in that context and getting at heat and human health. So to get at some of these issues, especially the shade issue, we also have wet bulb globe temperature, which was originally developed in the 1950s by the US military. And we calculate wet bulb globe temperature. It's a weighted average of three measurements. So it's a 70% of the wet bulb temperature. So how cool the air can get only through evaporation. So thinking about when you step out of the shower and you feel cold as, in the morning, how cold are you getting? That same idea in the atmosphere, for example. But then also if you're outside, you're thinking about, well, the sun's beating down on me or the wind's blowing by me and cooling me down or warming me up. And we can get at that with the black globe temperature, which incorporates the effect of wind and sunlight. We take 20% of that black globe temperature. And then finally, there's 10% of the dry bulb temperature, which is that traditional temperature observation we're also familiar with. So that's how we get to the wet bulb globe temperature. But again, how do these compare? Well, firstly, it's important that they both consider atmospheric moisture, which is key when thinking about heat and human health. And it's all about knowing your audience and what your audience needs. Heat index, again, considers air temperature and relative humidity, but is measured in the shade. It's calculated in the shade. Wet bulb globe temperature is measured in the sun, thinks about temperature, humidity, and then wind, clouds, and that sun angle, how hard the sun is beating down on you. So in practice, what does this look like? Well, both of these have different categories where you have to start to think about being worried about values. So for heat index there on the left, you can see that we start to get caution at 80, extreme caution at 90, so on and so forth, extreme danger at 125. Wet bulb globe temperature on the right, we're in region 3, and Mackenzie will touch on this a bit more, but we have low, elevated, moderate, all the way up to extreme, but you'll note that those extreme values start at just 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's because of the different way in which they're constructed. So if we think about an 85-degree wet bulb globe temperature day, which you see is moderate, on the high end of moderate, you can see in May, we generally see somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 12, 5 to 10, depending where you are in the southeast, with days over wet bulbs of 85 degrees Fahrenheit. July, you'll see we're already at about 2/3 of the month, again, that peak of the heat season. And then September, back down to about half of the month, somewhere between 12 and 14, depending where you are in the southeast generally. And just to give you another example of how the numbers vary, so in Raleigh, North Carolina, where we're based, our record temperature here is 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The record heat index is 115 degrees 0.1 Fahrenheit. And the record wet bulb is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see how the numbers might lead people to believe different things. So that's a drawback to wet bulb, is that the values don't inherently resonate as extreme. Some general public will see bigger number equals must be warmer. I can handle 95, but 115 sounds heavy. And that's where you have to think about that wet bulb being extreme at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. However, as we talked about earlier, the heat index might not accurately represent what that risk is if you're an active population, if you're a farm worker, if you're a construction worker, if you're overseeing athletes, high school or college. So they all have their drawbacks, and again, thinking about that audience. So again, incorporating relative humidity and temperature together leads us to a more complete evaluation of heat and human health. Heat index, thinking about the general public and in the shade. Wet bulb globe temperature, think about active populations and in the sun. And now thinking about how you can monitor those yourself, I'm going to put it over to Corey Davis, our assistant state climatologist, and he will take you through some monitoring tools and trends that we have available for you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Greg. Again, my name's Corey Davis. I'll be popping on throughout the webinar to share some different tools you can use to track heat in your area and all across the Southeast region. So I wanted to start with some real-time monitoring tools. It's easy to understand the value of these. These are sharing current conditions so you can see what it's like on the ground or in the environment right now. And these are typically measured at weather stations with high-quality sensors, so you know you're getting an accurate read on what those conditions are like. One of the challenges, though, is that when it comes to heat monitoring, there are lots of choices available. I compare this to walking down the cereal aisle in the grocery store. If you don't know exactly what you're looking for, it's easy to get overwhelmed. As we just heard from Greg, there are lots of different options about which variable to look at. We've got the traditional air temperature, the heat index, wet bulb globe temperature, and then some new experimental products like the heat risk product from the National Weather Service. There are also lots of different places where you can go to find this information. I will highlight some examples from these throughout the webinar today, but the National Weather Service has done a great job of putting more data on their website. State climate offices like ours are also producing this information. The Southeast Regional Climate Center has been one of the leaders in this part of the country on heat and its impacts on humans. And then, of course, you can pull up your smartphone weather app, and that'll tell you what that heat risk looks like, maybe even give you a warning when you're getting into some more extreme conditions. So, no way we'll be able to touch on all of these, but again, we want to cover a few today that may be useful. Before we start talking about some of these products, just wanted to acknowledge, like Greg said, that there are special considerations. They go into each of these calculations and measurements. And especially for wet bulb globe temperature, we know that it does usually require special equipment like that black globe thermometer, so it may not be quite as easy to come by. But there are places where you can look at this online. To make it easy to find this, we've put together a table that shows all across the region and state by state where you can view current air temperature, heat index, and wet bulb globe temperature data. You can find this table on our Extreme Heat dashboard site. You see the link on the screen. And again, we've tried to bring together as many sources as we can, especially local, state mesonets like our Econet at the State Climate Office. So that's the example I wanted to show here. This is our Econet wet bulb globe temperature tool. This will let you see current conditions, but also go back and view past conditions. And that's what I'm showing on the map here. This was one of the hotter days last summer in July. At this time, we were seeing widespread high to extreme wet bulb globe temperature conditions across really the eastern two-thirds of the state. Now, like Greg mentioned, a lot of times you see these values that are in the upper 80s or low 90s, and inherently you don't think about these as being hot, and that's why usually when reviewing wet bulb globe temperature, we try to color code that so it's easy to see which areas are at the high level or which areas are at the extreme level, and certainly you could pick those out in this example. So I encourage you to look at that table, look at the data that's available for your area, and see as we go into the heat season what monitoring information is available near you. Now, shifting gears a little bit to our next section, which is about research. I wanted to highlight some of the research that our office worked on as part of a separate NOAA MAP funded project over the last couple years. The goal of this project was to better understand what heat vulnerability looks like all across the Southeast. And we started that by just getting a feel for what historical wet bulb globe temperature conditions were, which areas were at the highest risk, and what those trends have looked like over time. So to do that, we looked at historical weather station observations, mainly from airport-based stations across the region. In some cases, these stations have data going back to 1950 or earlier, so that does give us a good long period of record that we could use for this analysis. Now, one challenge is that these airport-based stations do not have that special equipment, that black globe thermometer. So we had to look at some algorithms that help us estimate that using things like the air temperature and the wind and the sunlight, some of those factors that Greg mentioned earlier. And then we validated those by comparing those with actual observations from our North Carolina Econet. So again, that helped give us a better feel for what these historical conditions have looked like across the region. Here's just a couple of the key takeaways from that work. First off, we found that all across the Southeast, we have seen an overall warming trend, especially with those daily maximum wet bulb globe temperatures. In other words, the hottest conditions you'll likely feel on a given day, those values are increasing over time. Now, the degree of that trend varies from location to location, but in general, we found some of the areas that are warming the fastest are our coastal locations, especially further south, down in Daytona, in Miami, and Tampa, and then also some of our inland cities, so places like Raleigh and Charlotte, Macon, Georgia also, they consistently showed the biggest trend over time. So then what do these trends look like in practice? Well, here's a graph that shows for the Raleigh area how those wet bulb globe temperatures, again, the warmest that you'll see on a given day, have warmed up per year. One way I like to look at this is just the scale on the y-axis here. So back in the 1960s and 1970s, most years were averaging a maximum of somewhere in that 80 to 82 degree range. That's in the code yellow or elevated level. And then as time has gone on, we have seen a consistent shift where now we're in that 84 to 86 degree range. That's at the upper end of the moderate range and even getting into the high range. And again, these are not the most extreme values in a given year. This is just the average of all days during the summer. So what we can tell based on this is first off, we are seeing a warming trend, but also that intensity of summer heat is really a step above what we've seen in the past and maybe what your father or your grandfather had worked in outdoors. So again, that's really, I think, eye-opening to see what that change looks like. If you want to know more about this research, you can look at our paper that was published a couple years ago. We've also got a blog post on our website that explains more about this work. But at this point, to talk more about our research, I'll hand it over to my colleague Mackenzie Peters to go over some other exciting work that our office has been a part of.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. Again, my name is Mackenzie Peters, and I'm the EcoNet researcher here at the State Climate Office. So we're going to shift focus to discussing some of our newer work that's been done in our office. But before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborator on this project, Dr. Tim Glattfelty. I'll also note that the results I'm showing today are preliminary and have not yet been published. So currently, the National Weather Service issues heat advisories when the heat index exceeds 105 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 consecutive hours, and excessive heat warnings when it exceeds 110 degrees Fahrenheit. To see how often these thresholds are reached in North Carolina, we analyzed heat index data from our statewide weather station network during the years of 2020 through 2025 and months May through September, which, as Greg previously mentioned, is the heat season in the continental US. For each station, like the one shown in the photo here, we calculated the average number of days per year that met these thresholds. And what we found was that hazardous heat days occur more frequently in the central and eastern regions of North Carolina compared to the western region. So, after establishing how often the current heat index thresholds are met, our next step was to incorporate wet bulb globe temperature into our analysis so we could compare the two heat metrics. To do that, we categorized our WBGT dataset into 5 threat levels using the ranges shown here. To make this more comparable to our heat index dataset, we implemented this 2-hour criterion where we classified each day of the heat season based on the maximum WBGT threat level reached for at least 2 consecutive hours. That then served as the foundation for us to do a direct comparison of average annual occurrences between the two metrics. So both maps shown here are on the same color scale, and this visually highlights that high and extreme heat conditions, which are shown in the top right, occur much more frequently than heat advisories and excessive heat warnings, which are shown in the bottom left. This also goes to show that while both metrics describe heat advisories are not capturing that full range of days where we can see dangerous outdoor working conditions. So with that baseline established, we can look at how this played out during specific heat seasons, particularly 2025, which many of us might remember as feeling exceptionally hot. So here, we're looking at the number of heat advisory and excessive heat warning days per year across North Carolina, with 2025 shown separately from the 2020 to 2024 average. So compared to previous years, 2025 brought a noticeable increase in the number of these days, particularly across the eastern part of the state. Areas that typically saw about 1 to 5 days per year in the earlier time frame experienced closer to 10 to 15 in 2025. We also see these conditions creeping westward, with more stations across central North Carolina experiencing higher frequencies than in years prior. A similar pattern appears when we look at high and extreme WBGT days. Not only do we see an increase in the frequency of these conditions across the central and eastern regions, but the contours also shift westward, again highlighting that westward expansion of hazardous heat in 2025. When we compare the two metrics directly, a difference that stands out is that WBGT maps on the right cover a much larger area than the maps on the left. So this raises an important question of if the current heat index threshold is set too high to capture many of the hazardous heat conditions that WBGT identifies. So to explore that idea, we tested what happens when we gradually lower the heat index from 105 to 97. And as we lower this threshold, we see a steady increase in the number of hazardous heat days per year. By the time we reach 97, the spatial patterns between the two metrics begin to look very similar. So the initial mismatch that we saw at the beginning suggests that the current heat index threshold might be too high. So Our next step was to formally identify a heat index value that produces better agreement with high and extreme WBGT days. And that became the basis for our optimization analysis. Here, our goal was to identify the heat index threshold that maximized overlap with high and extreme WBGT days while minimizing overlap with our moderate days. So at the current heat index threshold of 105, only about 78% of extreme days are captured and just 8% of high days. After weighing the trade-offs across different heat index values, we found that 100 degrees performed fairly well. It's a clean, round threshold that captured 100% of extreme days and just over 50% of high days. However, 98 degrees provided a better overall agreement since lowering that threshold just by 2 degrees increased overlap with high days by about 23%. So this suggests that in the southeast, particularly at lower elevations, people should begin considering hazardous heat impacts when the heat index approaches 98. In higher elevation regions, which are typically cooler, populations tend to be acclimated to milder heat conditions. We found that extreme and high WBGT days are relatively rare, meaning that moderate conditions are often the most severe heat these people experience. However, there's still some uncertainty about how hazardous moderate conditions truly are. This led us to explore whether the heat index threshold should be lowered even further for this region. Around 91 degrees Fahrenheit is where we begin to see an increase in heat advisories across Western North Carolina. And as we lower that heat index threshold, agreement with moderate WBGT days improves. So just as we did for Central and Eastern North Carolina, we asked whether there might be an optimal threshold specifically for this mountain region, recognizing that the answer would likely be less straightforward. This analysis is further motivated by this map, which Greg showed earlier, and this shows that WBGT values above 85 are relatively rare in the mountains. And as a quick reminder, 85 degrees Fahrenheit corresponds to that high threat level. So because these conditions occur so infrequently at higher elevations, that just reinforces the need to include moderate threat levels in our optimization rather than just focusing on only high and extreme conditions. And when we incorporate moderate days into our analysis, we find that a heat index threshold of 88 produces the best agreement, with more than 75% of overlap with our moderate WBGT days. So this suggests that in higher elevation regions of the southeast, people should begin considering heat risk when the heat index approaches 88 degrees. And now that we have our two heat index thresholds, we want to compare them with thresholds used by other organizations to warn about extreme heat. One of them being the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, which uses heat index in their heat health alert system. So we found that the thresholds we identified fall within a similar range, particularly in the early and the late season maps. This increased confidence in our results, especially since the values shown in these maps are associated with increases in heat-related illness based on local emergency room visits and mortality records. So in other words, we're looking at two distinct methods and data sets that are converging on the same conclusions, which reinforces the robustness of the thresholds that we identified. Additionally, referring back to the chart that Greg showed earlier, our Western region threshold falls within that caution category, while the Central and Eastern threshold falls within that extreme caution category, which further bolsters the validity of our results. So to wrap things up here, I'll highlight a few of the main takeaways from our preliminary work. The first one being that we can roughly translate between heat index and WBGT by using these thresholds that capture most high and extreme WBGT conditions, with the addition of moderate for higher elevation regions. For low elevation areas, 98 degrees Fahrenheit was decidedly a good option, while in higher elevation areas, we thought that 88 degrees Fahrenheit was pretty comparable. So an actionable takeaway is that you can use these numbers in your own monitoring to anticipate potential extreme heat impacts. And then lastly, this work suggests that the National Weather Service might want to consider adjusting their heat advisory criteria to better reflect these impactful heat conditions. So at this time, We're about halfway through the webinar, so I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Tim to see if we have any questions at this time.
Alrighty, well, thank you, Mackenzie. I apologize to everybody. I'm slightly under the weather today, but I'll do my best to make sure your questions get answered. So far, we have one question that's directed specifically towards Corey. And so what we see is, Corey, do you know why there were high wet bulb globe temperature values in the 1950s compared to the 1960s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll note that the graph I showed was for Raleigh. It showed that trend where we had kind of a spike in the early 1950s, but we see the same thing for the Charlotte area. So I think we can kind of discount any very localized features. Instead, I think this is probably a product of just these airports had only been open for 10 years or so by that time. So we may have still been kind of getting those sensors calibrated right and also getting some of the local surroundings built up, especially with more vegetation in those areas. And then also, I think there's just a general climate trend we can look at. That period in the 1950s was generally fairly warm and also fairly dry, so it makes sense that we might have some hotter years in there. After that, we shifted over to what was a fairly cool period in the 60s and 70s. So I think you're just seeing a comparison between a hotter period and then a cooler one right after. So that's why it looks like we've gone down and then have gone back up. Again, we would just look at what those trends have been like, especially since the 60s and 70s and even 80s, and it definitely does show a pretty steady increase over time.
Okay, great. So another question that we have, this one is for Mackenzie. So is there a concern that if the National Weather Service were to adjust the advisory and warning criteria, they would be overwarning for events?
Yeah, so I think the idea of our optimization was to try and find that sweet spot where you wouldn't be overwarning. And the percentage that we kind of based that off on was that 75 percent. So for example, in the mountain region, we had 75% of moderates. And that impersonal communication was seemed to be like a good sweet spot. So we're trying to avoid the overwarning using our optimization process there.
And one other thing I would add to that quickly is whenever we were setting up this optimization study, we made sure that whenever we were finding the sweet spot, you were never warning more than 15% of the total heat time or the total heat season time. So it's constrained in that way as well. So there are some other questions, but I guess we'll hold on to those towards the end and continue on with our webinar. I'll toss it back to Corey.
Yeah, thanks, Tim and Mackenzie. So, yeah, I'll check back in here with another tool. We just heard some good insights from Mackenzie about heat index and especially how that can be used to track what those heat impacts look like all across the state and across the region. So, I wanted to share a good tool you can use for finding current heat index observations. This is the National Weather Service's Weather and Hazards Data Viewer tool. It's a map-based tool, and when you first go there, you will see lots of dots popping up on the map, lots of numbers to show what conditions look like across the region. If you want to view heat index in particular, then in the overlays panel, you'll want to select heat index. Again, you can also go back and look at historical data here, or you can look at the most current and latest information. When you do that, you'll see the heat index data loads on the map. And then what's nice about this tool is as you zoom in further and further, closer to your local area, even more data points will pop up on the map. For most major areas across the Southeast, you will have at least a good handful of local observations to look at. So again, that is giving us a very good, accurate, localized picture about what heat index values look like. And again, just as a refresher from what Mackenzie just told us, we know that for most low elevation areas, when you start getting these heat index values above 98 degrees, that's where you're seeing the high and extreme categories come into play. We know that there are definitive heat impacts. Those are more dangerous heat levels. And there's things like certain break time per hour that are tied with each of those as well. So that can be a good trigger for when you may want to put your own heat response plan, for instance, into play. So with that said, I will shift back over to Allison. She'll talk more about heat health impacts, and then we'll have one more tool to show at the very end.
All right, thanks, Corey. So let's talk about how these numbers translate into health impacts. So the first thing that you need to know is that heat illness can be prevented. But there are a few pieces of information you need to know in order to prevent heat illness. So, number one, who's at greatest risk? Number two, when to take action. And number three, what actions should you take? So, we're going to go through all of those. So, let's talk about at risk groups first. Anyone can experience health impacts from extreme heat, but some individuals are at a greater risk than others. Older adults and children are more sensitive to temperature swings and dehydration. People managing illness or pregnancy can experience an increased strain on the heart and kidneys, and heat can also make symptoms worse. Certain medications increase people's sensitivity to heat, and low-income households may have limited access to cooling and safe, well-insulated housing. People who sustain physical activity in high heat scenarios, like outdoor workers, athletes, or even indoor workers in hot environments like kitchens and warehousing, are at an increased risk of heat illness. And lastly, the body needs to build a tolerance to heat gradually over time. So early season heat waves are especially dangerous for this reason. Another group to consider is tourists visiting from cooler climates. And a statistic that might surprise you is that most outdoor fatalities, between 50 to 70%, occur in the first few days of working in warm or hot environments. So, what does this mean for folks working in our farmlands? Well, there is an overlap between the areas that see the most frequent extreme wet bulb globe conditions and agricultural lands. Southeastern farms, as you see circled here on the map, and farm workers are on the front lines of extreme heat. The built environment can also create concentrated areas of extreme heat. In fact, during our urban heat mapping campaign, we recorded more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit temperature difference in the evening temperatures for Durham, North Carolina. This highlights just how much surfaces like brick, concrete, and asphalt can absorb and release heat as the sun goes down. What is special about these pockets of cooler temperature, these blue spots on the map? Well, those areas had dense vegetation that helped provide shade and kept those spaces cooler. So let's talk about how to recognize heat illness. For heat exhaustion, you're going to be looking for symptoms like dizziness, thirst, heavy sweating, nausea, and weakness. If you see those things, or if you're experiencing those things yourself, be sure to move to a cooler area, loosen any tight clothing, drink cool water, and seek medical support if those symptoms don't improve. Now, what's different about heat stroke? In that case, you'll see things like confusion, dizziness, or even unconsciousness. You want to call 911 immediately because heat stroke can be deadly. If you are, or someone you know is experiencing these symptoms, move that person to a cooler area, loosen any tight clothing and remove any extra layers, and help them cool down with water or ice as you wait on emergency personnel to arrive. The key takeaways here: heat illness is preventable. Some people are at greater risk, including outdoor workers, and it's important to know the signs of heat illness so you can respond quickly. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Corey to share a little bit about our new tool.
Thanks, Allison. This will be last but hopefully not least for the webinar today. Allison mentioned from the start that we have just finally released our Southeast Heat Monitor tool this month, but several years of development went into this, along with the research that we already shared today. So let's talk about the heat monitor, then we'll give an example of what it looks like and how it can be used. Again, this was developed through that NOAA MAP funding that was looking at regional heat vulnerability across the Southeast. We knew that in this project, we wanted folks to be able to have a concrete way to explore that data, what it showed for their area, especially in the short-term forecast. So we really tried to build a tool that combines all the things we talked about on the webinar today. The different heat metrics that Greg talked about earlier, some of that historical research and climatology that we looked at, and also the heat health impacts that you just heard from Allison. The thought was that by combining all these, that would give a more comprehensive look at what heat risk looks like and then what specific conditions are the most dangerous. We're used to every summer day being hot, but the goal of this tool is to be able to flag what are the days where that heat is a level above what we're used to seeing at a given time of year, where folks may not be acclimated or adjusted to those conditions. So with that said, we can jump straight into our demo for the heat monitor. The link to the tool is at the bottom here, and I will switch over to a web page that I'll note is an older version of the tool. This is using data from last summer. This lets us show an example of some more extreme heat conditions across the Southeast that happened last July. When you first come to the tool, obviously you'll notice the options to select a date. By default, the next 3 days will always be available here. So again, this is very much a short-term forecasting tool. It's planning ahead for today and then the next couple days after that. As we scroll down, we'll see the main feature of the tool, which is the map here. This is showing the forecasted daily maximum wet bulb globe temperature, but we're showing that using the color-coded categories. As we did some testing in the development of this tool, we found that showing those actual numbers really doesn't resonate well with a lot of folks. Greg mentioned that earlier as well. We found that showing these categories and the associated threat levels seems to be a better way to communicate that risk level. When you come to the page, it'll automatically try to determine your local location and show that on the map. You can also type in your address in this box or click on the little mouse button and then click anywhere on the map to select a different location. I'll note that when you do that, it'll load a panel down at the bottom that has specific local forecast details for that area. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. First, I wanted to talk about that climatological component that we had worked into the tool. Again, trying to show areas where the forecasted heat is really a step above what we're used to seeing at a given area and a given time of year. The way that we've added that in is through these hot zones layers, and there's 5 different layers available. But I'll note these are all based on historical conditions, again, conditions that go back to 1950. They give us a good long-term picture about what that baseline heat level is. First, we can look at areas where the forecasted heat is above average. That name is pretty self-explanatory, but that's just showing areas where, again, the forecast is just hotter than normal for that time of the year. In this example from last July, you see most of the Southeast region is highlighted in green, and that's pretty much what we would expect. This was a very widespread heat wave in the middle of summer, so most areas were feeling above average heat. Next, we can go up to the uncommon hot zone. This is calculated as the average plus one standard deviation. So this is essentially showing about the 30% of all warmest days for this time of the year, and where the forecasted heat is again above that level. So in this case, that excluded some parts of the deep south, but still included much of the rest of the region. Then we can look at where the forecasted heat is above the top 10% of all warmest days at this time of the year. Again, that excludes some other areas, but still keeps in most of the Carolinas and Georgia and other pockets of the region. We can also see where it was forecasted to be one of the top 5 warmest% of all days at this time of the year. Again, we're keeping most of the Carolinas, parts of Georgia in there. And then finally, we see where it was forecast to be one of the top 1% of all hot days at this time of the year. Again, these are the very hottest days that we would ever expect. And you think about this timing, this is the middle of summer. This is already our hottest time anyway. So certainly these are the sort of heat conditions that most folks just would not be adjusted or acclimated to. So let's scroll down and look at some of the local forecasts here. Again, we've selected a location in Wake County near Raleigh, reviewing the summary of those 3-day forecasts. Of course, you can tell, again, we're highlighting that threat level, the category of the wet bulb globe temperature. In this area, we were at the high risk or red range on all 3 days. Then we're also showing what the daily maximum wet bulb globe temperature, air temperature, and heat index were expected to be. You see, we're also showing which hot zone we were in on each day. A couple days here, we're in that top 1% level. Then by the third day, we were down to the top 5%. Still very warm for that time of the year, but again, that helps differentiate the sort of level of heat compared to what we would usually expect. And then finally, we're showing the graphs for each day that shows how those heat conditions are expected to progress. The colored bars here are showing the wet bulb globe temperature. The blue line is the air temperature, and the magenta line is the heat index. So with that, it's easy to see what that progression looks like, when the hottest times are. And I'll also note that you can see similar information on the map. If you click any location, that'll pull up a pop-up, and that'll show the expected onset time of each of these categories. So in this area near Raleigh, by 11 o'clock that morning, it was expected to make it into the high risk range. Again, we know that there are specific actions tied to those levels, so that could help inform a heat action plan or how you're managing workers on that particular day. So let's talk about the final element of this tool, and this is one that we're really excited about because we haven't seen this on a lot of other tools. And that's the heat health messaging summary that we're showing at the bottom here. This is available for each day, so as you change days, you'll see this information refresh. But essentially, this is looking at lots of different factors that affect things that you may do outdoors in order to manage the heat level. One of those is the flag criteria. This is used by a lot of athletic groups to manage the duration of outdoor activities, including when those activities should stop because of the heat level. This is also looking at that wet bulb glow temperature category or threat level and specific actions, again, mainly surrounding break time per hour in those conditions. We're also looking at the hot zones. So, how much warmer than normal is it for a given time of year? And how might that affect folks, again, that are not accustomed or acclimated to that? And then we're also looking at the season because we know heat hits differently in the spring versus the summer or the fall. So, that season can have actions associated with it as well. A few other things I'll point out on this tool, and that's that if you're using it and you find something that you want to share, there are several ways to do that built in. First off, if you've selected your local location and you want to be able to view the forecast for that location every time you come to the tool, you can just use the link here, bookmark that, or save it to your inbox, and that'll help you automatically see your latest forecast. I'll mention the forecast in this tool update once per day. It's basically every night. So when you log on first thing in the morning, you'll know you're seeing the updated forecast for that date. Also, when you're viewing the map, there's a screenshot button here. You can click on that, and that will save an image of the current map view to your computer. So that's a good, easy way to share that. If you want to, again, email it to somebody, put it in a presentation, you have that available. Also, down here in the forecast panel, there's another screenshot button that'll save an image of this 3-day forecast, again, that you can share with other folks. And then finally, if you're looking at the heat health messaging and you want to copy that, you can just click the copy icon up here in the top right, and that will copy the text of this messaging to your clipboard. So again, that makes it easy to share that with others or to save that in a document. So again, excited to share the heat monitor with y'all. Hope you'll give it a chance, take it for a spin, especially as we start getting into some hot days this heat season. With that, I will hand it back over to Allison to wrap us up.
All right, thanks, Corey. I can see how useful this tool is going to be, especially as we move into the heat season this year. So, folks, now is your last chance to submit any questions that you've been holding on to. And Tim, I'm going to pass the mic to you to see where we should start.
All right, well, we have a few questions stacked up right now. The first one I'll toss to Greg. So this is on the public communication side. Do you have any suggestions for how to build an instinct among the public for when wet bulb globe temperature is dangerous or risky?
Sure, thanks, Tim. That's an excellent question. And I think perhaps the best way to do it is to get people to less focus on the number and more focus on the category, as Corey kind of showed in some of our heat monitoring tools, that thinking about what's the category I'm in and what action does that mean. So kind of moving it from number to here's your category, here's the action, so it goes right into something that can help save lives and keep people out of emergency rooms.
Okay, great, Greg. So the next question is tied to the work that Mackenzie did with me, and I'll go ahead and take these. So the first one is, do we know how our wet bulb globe temperature thresholds compare to NOAA's heat risk thresholds that extend beyond just heat index? And so since this is ongoing research, we haven't quite got that far yet, but that is definitely something we're going to do sometime here in the near future. As a related question to this is, how appropriate are the wet bulb temperature thresholds I have identified in states outside of North Carolina, such as Florida? And so this is a bit trickier, is because in North Carolina, we know that the thresholds we found are backed up by the emergency room data. And we looked into this trifecta where we identified this relationship with our mesonets, black globe temperatures, and the heat sensors to find these thresholds in the first place. And then that happened to align with the emergency room visits. But to do this in any other state, you kind of need to have the trifecta of all three of these things going on to be absolutely sure. I would say with some limited certainty, these relationships might carry over across the state line into South Carolina or just above into Virginia. But some place like Florida that has a much more tropical climate than North Carolina does, it would be harder to say because the people that live in Florida are going to be much more acclimatized to that warmer and more humid environment than people here. And this is especially a concern we dealt with the mountain thresholds. So next, I guess I will toss this to anybody who wants it, but I guess maybe Greg first is we've talked a lot about mostly just daytime extreme heat, but is there any way we can differentiate between days and nights?
I think that's an important distinction to make in terms of the dangers of heat. Obviously, often the daytime high temperatures, people see big numbers during the day, and that's, what sets all the alarm bells off. But almost more dangerous it sometimes is actually high overnight temperatures and thinking about high minimum temperatures because the body doesn't have a chance to cool off, especially for these vulnerable populations. And I know we've been seeing higher and higher nights in terms of temperature, at least, through the Piedmont of North Carolina and out especially on the coastal plain of North Carolina.
And this next one, I guess I will tee up to either Allison or Corey or both. And do we know how much local health departments are using these tools?
Well, I know the heat monitor is brand new, so I don't think they've had a chance to utilize it yet, but we are going to share one of the tools that are available from our local North Carolina Department of Health and Human Service. Uh, and it is regarding the heat health alerts. So they essentially send out text messages once certain thresholds are released are reached for specific counties in the state so that people can be notified for those. They also have ongoing research. So, they've created the thresholds that Mackenzie referenced in her maps, and they do update those based off of ED visits.
Well, it seems like that's the end of our questions. So unless there's any more last minute questions, we might be in a place where we could wrap up.
All right, sounds great. So we have created a suite of resources to make sure that you have all the information and tools that you need as we move into heat season this year. You can find them here. And I am also going to follow up with everyone who registered for this webinar with an email with all of these links included. So if you haven't been able to grab those, they will be coming to you later this afternoon with a link to that recording of today's webinar. And finally, I want to wrap up with a big thank you to all of the partners who have provided support, feedback, and data to help us make this research and these tools a reality. I'd also like to send a special thank you to the generous folks who helped Corey and I beta test to the Southeast Heat Monitor. It would not be as amazing as it is today without your help. Please reach out to us with any remaining questions that you have and stay safe and cool this heat season. Take care, everyone.